Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
So Happy New Year to you folks. I hope you had a lovely start to the new year. I'm very excited to record this first podcast with you. How have you been?
Yeah, thanks, Tanu. This is great. Happy New Year to everyone. It is the third podcast that the three of us are doing this year, but it's not the first podcast for All Things Policy. Yeah, it is our first podcast the three of us are doing as part of the 20 million jobs project that we've been working on. And I'm very excited about 2023 because I think jobs are getting much more attention than they were before. And I think more about that during the rest of the podcast. Yeah.
Awesome.
Sudisha.
Yeah, Anu, thanks for having me. And I'm excited to talk about some of the things that we've been working on in the past year.
Awesome. Well, before we talk about 2023 and the new year, let's talk about what jobs have looked like. As Sridhar said, we've been working on this for a while. So what have jobs looked like in the past few years? Isha, do you want to tell us about the last few decades and general employment trends?
Yeah, so I think it's important for us to start this assessment from maybe 1995. That's when I think a lot of the data is available since then. And our unemployment rate until 2020 had hovered around 5-6%. And it had been stagnant at that date. And this is official data, which one can easily find on any website related to macro trends. Which takes me back to the Overton window concept that I referred to in my first podcast with Takshashila. It's something that I learned while I was studying at Takshashila. And it refers to the range of policies politically acceptable to the mainstream population at a given time. So earlier, unemployment was an important criterion for people, but it was just not important enough to elect politicians. Preference was given to, let's say, issues like increase in income, increase in social security services, or safety, such as in Uttar Pradesh elections. But now unemployment has become a national issue. There have been riots in the past few years related to unemployment, election promises based on unemployment, and the last few months we've seen almost every other discussion related to the same. This just goes on to show how dire the situation is and how much needs to be done. If I were to lay out the characteristics of our jobs landscape in the last 2 decades, I would say that the first point would be that, first of all, there was stagnant and then rising unemployment. Second would be that the female labor force participation has declined a lot, and it's not a good look for our country and with our potential. The third would be that farm mechanization, which is expanding in India, it's making it difficult for agriculture to absorb unemployed people, which it generally used to do, especially during seasonal unemployment periods. And there has been observed an increased reliance on social security schemes such as Manrega. And this can be proven through data. During the pandemic, for example, around 2020, that the unemployment rate shot up to around 8% and kept hovering between 6.8% for 2 years. And this can be observed through CMIE reports that have been released in the past 3-4 years. In 2022 December, our unemployment rate hit the highest since 1991. And according to CMIE, this is 8.85%, which is incredibly high. And this can be proven through news reports, through trends, and it's not just something that that's been cooked up like this. It can be proven through several, let's say, indicators which are not directly contributing to unemployment, but they kind of show that, okay, if this is happening, this might lead to unemployment. So the first one would be that EPFO contributions have declined by almost 0.3 million in 3 months, as shown by their official payroll data. The second one would be that the number of people seeking jobs through Manrega has increased continuously. It was reported that around 70.3 million households, according to official data, were demanding for Manrega work in the last year, which is a lot, right? It's important to remember that Manrega is more often than not the last resort for everyone, which is indicative of the fact that other jobs are not present for them to absorb. Then India's falling exports is also another factor. Business Standard reported that in October 2022, exports fell to $29.8 billion, which is a 20-month low. And a contraction of 6.6% year on year has been observed. And the last would be that we all can see that there's a hiring freeze in tech companies. There's a hiring freeze in my company. I know there's a hiring freeze in your company, and it's happening. And we both of us, both you and I, work at enterprise level companies, which means that this is a really bad sign for jobs in general. We are seeing so many layoffs that are happening.
Wow. That's a lot of information. Thank you, Sudisha. That it seems like we're in a tricky situation, but I do wonder how we got here. Some folks may say COVID, some may say there is a lot happening in the world right now, climate change, geopolitical wars, etc. Sridhar, do you want to talk a little bit before we get into COVID? Do you want to talk a little bit about what are the broad factors that may be impacting us and how we maybe got here today?
Yeah, I think oil prices have been rising. The war in Ukraine has not helped. And there has been, because of COVID, you had this whole supply chain issues, disruptions leading to a lot of shortages, etc. And like that in turn, right, causing inflation. And then there was a lot of money which came into the market. Governments pumped in a lot of money during COVID, which led to a lot of liquidity. And then they froze on that liquidity now. Now they're all trying to control inflation. And I think in a situation where at one side you're trying to control inflation, and on the other side, there are really a lot of stress factors like the war in Ukraine, etc. It's leading to, Europe's already in some kind of recession. I think some countries admit it, some are not. But I think there is general consensus that Europe's already seeing some type of recession. The US Fed seems to be bent on controlling interest rates in a way that it actually leads to, they want to engineer a small recession to control inflation because they feel otherwise the inflation is, for the first time, I think in so many decades, the inflation rate in the US is higher than that in India, right? So I think that's a big one. The dollar has strengthened very significantly as a result. It has other currencies have been majorly hit. And there's a lot of flight to safety of money. So a lot of money is going there rather than elsewhere. And all this is creating a sense of despondency. People are not sure. I was at a conference where the government was asking private sector, why aren't you sort of investing? And I think the private sector is sort of reluctant to go all out and invest because two things which have happened. One, due to COVID, I think the most affected due to COVID are people in the sort of lower middle class, that group, right? The really poor got some basic benefits from government, etc., which sort of helped them sort of deal with stuff in a particular way. The rich had less money, less avenues to spend their money, so they saved up much more money and they were able to use that to invest. And now they're coming out, there's a demand for luxury goods, demand for higher end goods has not dropped. In fact, if you look at the television sales, find that the high-end TVs, those costing 60, 70,000 rupees and more, those are the ones which are getting sort of sold, while the ones at the lower end of the spectrum are not. So I think there's a huge number of people in the lower middle class who are sort of skilled, semi-skilled kind of people who seem to be out of jobs. And those jobs don't seem to be returning in a hurry. Right. So I think that's something that's seen. And now this overall impending global recession is making people wonder whether they should invest in they should make more capex investments. Even though this is at a time when utilization of many companies is at 85% and above. So it's not that the current utilization rates are low. The capacities are being highly utilized, and under normal circumstances, they would have gone all out and invested. But the global situation is making them pause and think before they go out to invest. The government, on the other hand, is sort of making some investments. Yeah.
Yeah, and let's talk about that shortly. And I think, as Sudisha said, this is going to be my first potential recession in the workforce. So it is interesting and some scary times as well. We're starting to see some slowdowns. how did we get here? I like to blame the pandemic for all things, honestly, but I don't think that that's the right attitude to have. So I did a little bit of research on this. That to me was a watershed moment. I didn't think that as a generation we would go through anything worse than that. But the jury's still out, I guess. And as far as jobs go, I started thinking about, did the pandemic actually cause this? But really, as an economy in India at least, our average GDP growth, as we've discussed in the past, had already significantly slowed down, right? So we were already slowing down to 6.5% in 2018, from the 8% that we were averaging at between 2014 and 2017. And then we went down even further to 4% in 2019 to 2020, right? Immediately prior to the pandemic year. So when the pandemic hit, really, we were going through the most prolonged economic slowdown as a country. And then I looked up who the pandemic actually impacted. And the Wire's State of Working India in 2021 is a report that the Wire came up with. And after 1 year of COVID, it documented the experiences of households and workers, beginning with the national lockdown of 2020. And what they found overwhelmingly was that the lockdown actually increased inequality dramatically, because most incomes that were wiped out from the bottom of the distribution. So Sridhar, to your point, while luxury goods still seem to be doing well, there is a general despondency in the atmosphere. And that's because inequality in our country has potentially gone up, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, the CMIE even said that in a 4-member household, we potentially lost about 15,700 rupees, which is over 2 months of income, right? And independent surveys also kind of corroborated the fact that the lockdown caused about 40 to 80% of informal sector workers had a huge loss in income. So overall, it seems like, of course, the lockdown had this impact, but it was slow to bounce back. And even when we did come back to pre-pandemic levels of employment, incomes remained significantly depressed. So while people may have had jobs, the quality of jobs and the amount that they were earning and disposable income wasn't that great, right? And around 15 million workers still remained out of work even at the end of 2020. And as we know, 2021 was the second wave, which, while it did not cause any lockdowns, the health impact was so much more, right? And even though we may think that the employment impact may not have been huge, the Wire actually did a very interesting study again, where they looked at mobility trends and they correlated mobility trends to income levels. And what they found out is, based on how immobile people had become due to the health impact in 2021, potentially their income would have fallen just as steeply as it did during the nationwide lockdown last year, right? Or in the year preceding that. So TLDR of it is 2020 and 2021 didn't just see a huge wipeout of jobs, but a big wipeout of income, which has been hard to recover from. And to Sudisha's point earlier, while labor force participation rate for women has increased again and has started to show a little bit of a recovery, the fact of the matter remains that women lost jobs disproportionately, and therefore as they come back into the labor force as well, they're probably not getting as high quality jobs, unfortunately, as they once did. And it may not be a matter of choice in terms of the employment that they're seeking today. Awesome. I think, well, not awesome, I guess, but we need to take a break at this point. So we will be right back and talk a little bit more about my not awesome statistics. All right, we're back. So after talking a lot about, the impact that COVID has had, the impact that the war has had, and essentially how we've got into this situation, maybe let's look at what are the sectors that did show some recovery and where do we go from here, right? So while we've spoken in past podcasts about sectors like travel and tourism, which were badly hit, about 5 million jobs were lost in the travel and tourism sector alone. We also know that this is a sector that potentially can give us a lot of growth as India moves into its next era, because we're set right for that success, right? Sridhar, do you want to talk a little bit more about how that could happen?
Yeah, I think the first thing that I was thinking about, I was reading about this interesting term, revenge tourism or revenge travel. Right. Yeah, many of us had to just sit at home and not go anywhere for months on end, and many well-laid travel plans and were all sort of forced to be cancelled. So now people, I'm told, are traveling with a vengeance. What about you, young people? I mean, are you people sort of part of that revenge travel brigade? I mean, are you getting out all the time?
I would like to take revenge on Delhi winters and travel to sunnier shores. So I'm currently freezing. But yeah, I have definitely noticed like I had a huge bucket list of things that I wanted to do in 2020. And now I'm making all these plans in 2023. And hopefully, yeah, and see sunnier shores sometime this year.
Yeah, so I think that travel's definitely going to pick up. I mean, I would be very surprised if it didn't. Though there's the sudden sort of rise in COVID in China seemed to have put a lot of fear in people's minds. I was reading in the newspaper today that demand for booster shots has sort of increased. 75% of Indians are yet to get a booster shot, right? And now I think suddenly people are waking up and saying, maybe it's worthwhile getting that booster now. So, shout out to that. I think it's not a bad idea. And so I think I did not see a significant drop in people going out, doing stuff, getting together with friends, etc. You do hear of many friends coming down with COVID, but it doesn't seem to instill the same kind of fear that it did a couple of years ago. I think people have just sort of accepted it as something that'll happen. You'll deal with it. You'll fall sick. You'll get well. You move on. So I think that's one. But I think what was interesting, I mentioned it in an op-ed that I'd written a while back, that in the previous budget, Nirmala Sitharaman had mentioned jobs just 3 times, right? So we thought that it's such an important thing for India. We need 20 million jobs. We create less than 2 on an average every year. And politicians were really not talking about jobs. They were talking about many other things. They're talking about actions which require to take up GDP growth, but not really about jobs. And I think to those who believe that every percentage increase in GDP will lead to a percentage increase in jobs, that's not true. Our employment elasticity has fallen over the last many years. And due to good things like productivity, the use of technology, mechanization, etc., we have improved our output, but our employment elasticity has fallen quite dramatically. So if you want a 1% increase in jobs, you need more than a 10% increase in employment today. I mean, in GDP. Otherwise, you're not going to have 1% increase in jobs. So for 20 million jobs, you need about a 5% increase in the number of jobs created in India. And that means that, you need to have employment elasticity grow up as well as GDP to grow significantly for that to happen. The government is doing a bunch of things. I think Sudisha can tell us a bit about the different government schemes that are afoot in order to do this. But before that, I just wanted to mention 2 things. One, I'm betting that Nirmala Sitharaman in the upcoming budget will mention jobs more than 3 times. She will mention it at least 10 times. That's one. Yeah, 10 times. Okay. So that's something that I'm sort of predicting. The second thing is that politicians across all hues are talking about jobs. I mean, Rahul Gandhi is going on this fabulous Padayatra from one end of the country to the other. I think, forget about my political leanings. I think it would have been a great trip to take, right? It would have been fabulous. I have enough time in the world. I could have sort of gone along with Rahul Gandhi or somebody else maybe, but whatever. But the point is that it would have been wonderful to sort of walk across the entire length of this country. But I think as he's walking and going along, I think there's lots of conversation about jobs. There are a lot of politicians, especially in the opposition, have taken up this topic and are talking about it quite a bit, which will force the government in turn to sort of address it in some shape or form. So, which I think is good. Sorry, you think they might? Yeah, do you agree?
No, I think it is top of mind. Yeah,
it has become much more top of mind than it was in the past. I think that's a big change which has happened in 2022. If you ask me, the number one thing which has happened in jobs in 2022. The other thing I also wanted to mention, we've been talking about career impact bonds since late 2020, early 2021. And I think the government has actually come out and it created something called a skill impact bond, along with the British Asian Trust and a bunch of consortium of banks and others, and Michael Dell Foundation. And they've got something called the Skill Impact Bond. It's about $14.4 million. And it's supposed to benefit some 50,000 women and young girls, etc. And it's supposed to help provide skills. And the repayment to financial investors will happen if the impact goals that they had are met. But I think we will But career impact bonds that, as we have sort of envisaged them, will do much more than just like, take one targeted set of training and go out.
Yeah.
It's about creating a whole ecosystem where you can track the impact of training across different sectors, across different organizations, and create a legal framework which is easy to adopt and replicate so that skilling can take place in India in a scale which is unprecedented. So I think that I'm very bullish about that in the coming year. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
You've heard it here first, folks.
Yeah.
So Nirmala Sitharaman is going to say jobs more than 10 times.
Yeah.
And Sudisha, do you have ideas on what's going to happen in 2023? And also, what do you, since Sridhar talked about the fact that GDP is intrinsically linked to jobs, can you tell us what the government's maybe doing about it?
Yeah, so I think what my research shows, it's more related to observation than ideas, because a lot, since the budget is going to come out next month, there's been a lot of demand from different sectors in India regarding particular schemes. What my research shows that 5 schemes will be very important for our GDP growth, and I think they will be definitely featured in the budget. The first one is Emergency Credit Line Guarantee Scheme. This was kickstarted during the pandemic, was included in the Atmanirbhar package. And even though it was meant for just providing credit to MSMEs, mostly just for the pandemic, because we are almost in an informal recession, I think definitely the scheme will be extended beyond the pandemic. And I think many MSMEs are going to benefit from this scheme. For people who don't know what this scheme is, under this scheme, financial institutions in India provide emergency loan facilities to various companies, especially MSMEs. The second scheme that I think will be very important is Production Linked Incentive Scheme, or as is commonly known as PLI scheme. We talk about creating an effective ecosystem in India that can spur manufacturing. And I think this scheme can prove vital in that. How the scheme works is that the government incentivizes specific companies to set up manufacturing units. And this could be in the form of tax rebates or import or export duty concessions, or maybe land acquisition, making that easier. So generally, the benefits of a PLI scheme are passed on to the final consumer of the goods as well. So this scheme has definitely benefited a couple of sectors in India, and every other day you will read news about now the government is planning to extend this in the leather sector. Now the government is planning to extend this in the, in the garment sector. So I think the scope of this scheme is just improving day by day. So I think that this scheme will be very important in the upcoming budget and this year in general. The third most important.
Yeah, I agree. And I think and if I may, Nisha, I think also want to mention that, while we were talking about geopolitical changes earlier, one thing that I did not mention was this need for a China plus one strategy that many large organizations across the world are adopting earlier. So they do want an alternative in manufacturing, outsourcing outside of China. And India, many countries like Vietnam, others seem to be sort of benefiting from it much more than India. But I think with the PLI scheme and a few other things, maybe India this time around will benefit and see a more significant manufacturing growth.
Yeah, and just to add on that, I think I was also looking at the RBI's reports on resiliency within sectors and why during the pandemic, of course, manufacturing nosedived during the first, lockdown. They actually spearheaded the post-first wave recovery and remained resilient during the second wave, and actually showing really good growth trends that even though the sector still needs some amount of recovery from post-pandemic, I think to Sridhar's point, this could become something that becomes a bit of a distinct competitive advantage for us if that's right. All right, Sudisha, the third scheme that you were telling us about.
Yeah, I think the third scheme is Credit Guarantee Trust Fund for Micro and Small Enterprises. I think this is one of the most successful schemes, if I may, which has come from the union government. Official data shows that over 5.5 lakh guarantees were approved, amounting to approximately rupees 42,000 crore by February 2021. And this scheme is so successful that every other day you will read news reports on several sectors demanding that they should also be included in the ambit of people who are benefiting from the scheme. So, for example, the Retailers Association of India on Thursday urged the government to extend all benefits available for registered MSMEs to retail traders as well in the country. So, definitely, I see this scheme being featured in the budget. The fourth one is RAMP scheme. This is a scheme that has been in the making for 2 years almost. It's a World Bank assisted central sector scheme. And approximately 808 million USD has been approved for this scheme. Some section of this budget will be borne by the World Bank, and the other parts will be covered by the Union Government of India. So this scheme is set to commence this year. So definitely I see it featuring in the budget. There's a lot of jargon when it comes to this scheme, but the key objectives simply are to increase credit to MSMEs, accelerate research with respect to how MSMEs can grow in India and be supported by the government, and increase technological adoption for MSME growth. And the fifth is not really a scheme, but I do see it, being a point of discussion in the next few months, and that's Udyam. So, when it comes to ease of doing business, we talk a lot about the fact that it's very difficult for businesses to register, right? To officially register as a business so that they can get access to credit or get access to any other government scheme benefits. So Udyam kind of helps that by providing like a web portal to companies so that they can register and then they can just use that certificate to obtain government benefits. There is official data which has been released by the government which shows that around 50% of Udyam enrollments were revoked last year. But the main reason for that decided as that they got the certificate, the businesses, they got the certificates, they got the benefits, and then they just didn't need it anymore. So that's why they revoked the certificate. And now SIDBI is planning to launch another Udyam-like portal to incentivize informal MSMEs to register and just to kind of increase the formalization of our businesses in India.
Yeah, that's quite interesting because I was on a panel along with Mr. Raman of SIDBI, who's the chairman managing director of SIDBI at CII earlier in December. And he was talking about exactly this and how this could have a big impact. I concur. I mean, I think it's a great thing.
Yep. Yeah. Well, I think we've spoken quite a bit about what has happened, what could happen. We know sectors like Sudisha has spoken a bit about how MSMEs in general are going to get a lot of attention from the government, hopefully, as they become the engine towards recovery. We know sectors like entertainment, for example, are still lagging behind, while startups, which the government has been very bullish on, given that we're third largest startup ecosystem, right, we're outranking China in terms of growth rates, etc., will also benefit from schemes like this. So super interesting times coming up. You can expect to hear a little bit more about career impact points that Sridhar spoke about in upcoming podcasts in some of our work. We've spoken about how going green could be the next essential and competitive advantage for India and India's ecosystem and creating jobs as well that are sustainable in nature. Anything else, folks, that you're excited to work on in 2023 or any big trends that you'd like to call out that you think our listeners should look forward to?
Yeah, no, I think one thing definitely is this career impact bonds. I briefly mentioned about the government's participation in the skill impact bond that they've launched. I think the success of that is going to be monitored over the next 4 years, and then we'll see. But I think there needs to be a lot more work and emphasis on skilling and finding innovative means of financing the upskilling. Because it's not that jobs are not there. I think the technology has changed dramatically, but there's a need for new types of jobs and new skills, and people need to acquire new skills. For that, they need training. For that, they need money. And for that, they need somebody with a risk appetite to be able to finance it. So I think that's something that I think is important and should see more light. The second area, definitely, like you said, I mean, India has to grow has ambitions of growing fabulously over the next 2-3 decades. And if that is to be achieved, and while keeping our commitments to COP26 and 27 intact, then we need to be doing that in an extremely green fashion. And for that, you need leadership in green technology. and India can't just afford to go out and buy some technology from elsewhere. We will have a huge amount of demand for going green. Our requirements are completely unique. Therefore, we will become leaders in green technology. You can look forward to more jobs in green in India. And the third thing, I think Takshashila has been talking a lot about this in the past, but not seen much progress in that direction. But right now, I'm seeing Karnataka is talking about beyond Bangalore. So they want to look at some 4 different cities and say, how can we invest in these 4 cities so that can happen? And then it's about, I think new cities need to be created. New state capitals are a huge opportunity. And maybe something will happen in that space. Sudisha, you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, I think the 3 things that I would like to add based on whatever work I've done in the past. The first one would be related to women's labor force employment because, as researchers, we can say that it's kind of like an overdone issue at this point because almost everyone is researching on that.
Never.
Yeah. No, the key problem lies here is that, as Sridhar has pointed out before also, that this is a social problem. And I definitely see a rise in social impact startups who are working on this. So a good example would be a company in Bangalore called Basis. Initially it was hard for me to gauge what exactly they're doing, but once I understood that, it was amazing because their startup is so completely focused on financial literacy for women. Right? A lot of the women, even if they're working here and there, they do not know how to handle finances. So I think that's where I see a little bit of rise. I've come across a couple of social impact startups like Safety Pin, Bases, and Buzz Women, for example. So I do see some positive research being done in that area. The second one would be that, like Sridhar said, I do see an increase in green jobs. I was not able to cover that in my government schemes, but the union government is coming up with schemes such as National Hydrogen Scheme and all that, right? So the union government, the union government is investing resources and doing a bit of research there, right, on different avenues for generating energy in India, which is so important for our economic growth. So I do see some positive development there. And the third one would be gig jobs. I see more and more people gravitating towards that because, let's just face it, some power lies with the gig workers as well. I've been reading news reports on how gig workers in India are able to earn more because, they are jumping from one platform to another. So they are kind of manipulating the whole system and it's working in their favor. And I definitely see a lot more labor law development when it comes to gig workers. It's just something that is becoming the new normal now. A lot more companies will come up, I think, which will continue to use gig workers as their main workforce. So I definitely see a regulatory development in that area. And I think that it will be very important for our economic growth.
What? Thank you, Sudisha. So looks like a lot to look forward to as well. Thank you for sharing your time and thoughts, Sridhar and Sudisha. And hopefully everyone enjoyed this podcast and everything that we have to look forward to in 2023 as well. Thank you for joining us and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.